Glory to Jesus Christ. Today we come to our last installment of our Bible study of the Gospels of the first 3 days of Holy Week. We've done 5 so far. This is the 6th, and the Gospel that we'll read today we would hear on Holy Wednesday morning at the Presanctified Liturgy. This will be on April 12th at 9:30 a.m. Again, completes our cycle of those first 3 days of Holy Week, remembering that the theme that kind of brings them all together is the end times. So before we read that gospel, I just wanted to comment to say that this has been a great joy for me to do this, doing the videos, and especially meeting in person to discuss the gospels in more depth and look at different sources that have commentaries, the services themselves that comment about these gospels. It's been really profitable for me. And I pray that it also has been for you. And I hope that there's a good payoff as we get to Holy Week, as you're in church and hearing the Gospels and the hymns that are sung connected to these Gospels, that it'll be just a little bit richer for us. And I hope, in my mind, we've achieved what I was hoping to do as we did this, to slow down Holy Week a little bit. So I hope that that has been the case. So the gospel for Holy Wednesday is Matthew 26, verses 6 to 16. And when Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him having an alabaster flask of very costly fragrant oil, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. But when his disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, "Why this waste? For this fragrant oil might have been sold for much and given to the poor." But when Jesus was aware of it, he said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a good work for me. For you have the poor with you always, but me you do not have always. For in pouring this fragrant oil on my body, she did it for my burial. Assuredly I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her." Then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you?" And they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver. So from that time he sought opportunity to betray him. And then let's hear from Theophylact as he comments on this gospel. So verses 6 and 7. And when Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him having an alabaster flask of very costly fragrant oil, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. And Theophylact writes, "Some say that there are 3 women who anointed the Lord, of whom the 4 evangelists make mention. Others say that there are 2, the one mentioned by John, who is Mary, the sister of Lazarus, and the one mentioned here by Matthew, who is the same one mentioned by Luke and Mark. Some say that this Simon the leper is the father of Lazarus, and that Christ cleansed him of leprosy and then ate dinner with him. Some also say that when the Lord told his disciples to go to a certain man who would show them an upper room furnished, that he sent them to this man. And of course, the man welcomed the Lord to celebrate the Pascha there. So when the woman saw the leper who had been cleansed, she dared to believe that she too would obtain remission of sins and cleansing of spiritual leprosy. She confessed great faith by unstingingly pouring out such precious myrrh. She poured it out on his head, honoring the chiefest part. And you also, O reader, if you suffer from the spiritual and pharisaical leprosy of arrogance, which cuts us off from God, accept Jesus into your house and anoint him with the myrrh of the virtues. For you are able to procure myrrh for Jesus, who has cleansed you of your leprosy, and to pour it over his head. What is the head of Christ, if not his divinity, to which we offer the fragrance of the virtues? For David says, "Let my prayer be set forth as incense before you, O Lord. Offer then fragrance of myrrh, intricately blended of many virtues, to Christ's divinity. For if you teach that Christ is not merely a man, but also God, then you have made fragrant his head, that is, his divinity, with your words of theology. And then verses 8 to 11. But when his disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, Why this waste? For this fragrant oil might have been sold for much and given to the poor. But when Jesus was aware of it, he said to them, Why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a good work for me. For you have the poor with you always, but me you do not have always. And Theophylact writes, Since the disciples had heard much about almsgiving and had taken it and had given it much consideration, they found fault with the woman, thinking that God desired mercy towards others more than honor for himself. But he rebukes the disciples for their unwarranted criticism of the woman. For one should not expect exalted things from those who have only recently approached Christ, and especially from those whose emotions are unrestrained, but one should accept even their measure of faith. For whenever someone wants to offer a gift to God, do not scorn him or cut him off in his eagerness by sending him away to give to the poor, but let him fulfill his offering. But if he should ask your advice as to whether he should give to the poor or make an offering to God, advise him to give to the poor. However, if he has already made the offering to God, there is no reason to scorn him, for one should prefer honor rendered to God above everything else, even almsgiving itself. Nor should you think that because Christ, in his love for mankind, accepts mercy shown to others as something offered to himself, that we should overlook God and only practice almsgiving. For if this were so, we ought then to steal from the temples and use what is stolen for almsgiving. But it is not so. And that you may understand that it is not the same thing to show mercy to the poor and to honor Christ himself and to serve him, listen. For you have the poor always with you, but me you do not have always. Do you see then that it is one thing to serve Christ and another thing to show mercy to the poor, even though Christ in his love for mankind accepts for himself the things that are done for the poor? And then verses 12 to 13. For in pouring this fragrant oil on my body, she did it for my burial. Assuredly I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial for her. He teaches us, Theophylact writes, that the woman did this by some divine inspiration, prefiguring his death and the burial of his body. For the Lord would not have allowed himself to be anointed with myrrh if it did not reveal a mystery. Being God, he foretold what would be, that the deed which the woman did would be told everywhere in praise of her. Behold God's love for mankind, how he rewards the woman with a great gift, for he causes her memorial to be kept universally for as long as his gospel endures. How did the myrrh symbolize his burial? It was the practice among the Jews to prepare bodies for burial by anointing them with myrrh, as the Egyptians did to prevent decay and foul odor. He is saying, by pouring the myrrh, the woman shows that my body will be buried. He said all these things to shame and reprove Judas, by whom he would be betrayed and handed over for burial. Understand it is also in a spiritual sense. The leper is the Gentile people. The sinful woman is the congregation and the church from among the Gentiles, who poured out myrrh, that is, faith, on the head of Christ, which is his divinity. For everyone who believes that Christ is God pours out myrrh on the head of Christ. But Judas, who rebuked the woman, as John says, is a symbol of the Jews who still to this day murmur against the church. And then verses 14 to 16. Then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you? And they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver. So from that time he sought opportunity to betray him. Theophylact writes, when the woman who was a stranger and a harlot had shown Jesus such honor, Then it was that his own disciple departed to betray him. For it was not without meaning that the evangelist says, went, but in order to show the shamelessness of Judas. He adds the name Iscariot to better identify him, for there was another Judas who was also called Lebbaeus, Lebbaeus. The betrayer, however, was from a certain village named Iscariot. They covenanted with him for 30 pieces of silver. That is, they agreed, they determined an amount to give, and not, as many think, that they weighed out and paid the money. He sought an opportunity to betray him to them when he was alone, for they feared the multitude, and for this reason they paid Judas to inform them when Jesus would be alone. And that's the gospel on Holy Wednesday morning. As we gather on Wednesday in person, I'm hopeful, this is a little tease, I guess, I'm hopeful that we're going to have a guest with us who's going to speak a little bit about this gospel and also the hymnography of the church connected with it. So again, it's been a great joy, this series, this 6-part series of these gospels of the first 3 days of Holy Week. And again, I pray that it's been fruitful for you. Glory to Jesus Christ.